When I was getting into an interchangeable lens system, I felt overwhelmed by the number of options between native glass, vintage, and budget modern lenses. For my style of shooting, I knew that I wanted a 27-ish millimeter lens, but ended up having to try a few. So I'm making this video really for one reason, which is to help people who may find themselves in the same position as me. The first lens I got was the Minolta MD Celtic 28mm f2.8. It's a solid lens with a bit of gravity to it due to its mostly metal construction. I love the feeling of this lens in my hands. Raising it up to my eye and dialing in the focus feels great. The problem is that it's big. The lens itself is decently small, but it needs an adapter to take up the flange distance on mirrorless. While this lens setup isn't big by most standards, I was coming from a point and shoot and wanted something I could slip easily into a bag or jacket pocket. For that reason, the second lens I got was the Meike or Meike 25mm f1.8. This lens has an all-metal construction with a smooth focus and aperture ring. While the lens itself is about the same size, it doesn't need an adapter, making the whole package much smaller. I really liked the setup, but wanted to know what I was missing out on. That finally led me to the Fujinon XF 27mm f2.8. This lens is tiny and light, but the manual focus is by wire, so most of the time I just use the autofocus. Most of the subjects I photograph aren't exactly the most dynamic, but the autofocus is useful, especially when I can't get the camera up to my eye. All three of these lenses can take good images, but the image quality isn't identical. My Minolta lens has a bit of wear on its coating and loves the softened light, giving things a bit of a glow, or what some people call a vintage feel. But despite this, it's still wicked sharp even on the open end. It's no bokeh monster, but up close, it gives a beautiful and dreamy out-of-focus render. The Meike is definitely sharp too when stopped down, but I've noticed a bit more of an issue with chromatic aberration and barrel distortion. Luckily, both of these are easily fixable in post. It has the tightest minimum focus distance of all three, as well as the widest aperture. However, at 25mm, I'm never really looking for a super shallow depth of field anyway. The Fuji is definitely the sharpest out of all three, and feels the most clinical in its contrast and color rendition. It's also by far the smallest. Meike also makes a 28mm f2.8, which is almost the same size, but the reviews didn't seem great. Keep in mind that Chinese lenses at this price point are a little notorious for inconsistency in manufacture, and my review is only of this specific copy. So where does that leave me? I'm glad I got into adapting Minolta, if not for this lens, then for these. The Minolta SR mount is also common enough to allow me to use other lenses such as this Vivitar, and lenses like this Camaro 200mm, which cost me almost nothing. I think that I would have ended up getting the Fujinon eventually, since the autofocus changes the way that I'm able to shoot while covering a familiar focal length. This is the only native glass that I own, and I love it. It's small, discreet, and the autofocus is snappy enough for me. If I could do it again, I would have skipped the Meike. While it's a good lens, I prefer the Minolta for manual focusing, and it lacks the advantages in size and compatibility of the Fujinon. Some of these modern Chinese lenses are good, I'd just rather have the vintage glass for a manual tactile experience when that's what I'm after. The reason I got the Meike is that I found a used copy for cheap and wanted to see if by getting it I could avoid buying the Fujinon. Now that I have the Fujinon, it doesn't really have a place anymore. However, if I could only have one, I might go with the Meike. It's small enough for me to carry everywhere and allows me to manual focus non-by-wire. I love shooting manual, the process of dialing in focus and aperture just works for me. However, I appreciate that the Fujinon allows me to take images in situations where I wouldn't have time or space to focus manually. I also love adapting. Being able to use great lenses from yesteryear for cheap is definitely something that I'll continue to do. I also love that I can take the same lenses and put them on vintage bodies. In summary, go straight to Fuji glass if you want autofocus, or want the absolute smallest size and lightest weight. Go for vintage if you want bargain high quality lenses. or also want to use them on film, keeping in mind what you sacrifice in portability. Get a Chinese lens if you want a smaller size, but still want that manual experience. Again, all of these lenses take good images and haven't really had that big of an impact on the way that I see compositions. They do, however, have a big impact on the way that shooting feels for me. And unfortunately, that's not something you can really share through a video.